He thought she was just another invisible maid, until a cheap silver ring made the most powerful man in the room forget how to breathe. The chandelier light spilled across crystal glasses and polished marble, laughter echoing through the penthouse as New York's elite celebrated a union built on power, money, and carefully curated appearances. And in the middle of it all, Amara Hayes moved quietly between them, her posture straight but her presence deliberately small, a tray balanced and steady. Hands that had learned long ago how to exist without being seen, her dark skin catching the warm glow of gold light, while whispers brushed past her like cold air, not meant for her, never meant for her. Just another maid in a black uniform blending into luxury she could never claim. Across the room stood Ethan Cole, the man whose name alone could silence conversations, his tailored suit fitting like a second skin, his expression carved from discipline and distance, a man who built an empire. From nothing and trusted no one. Not even the woman standing beside him in diamonds and silk, smiling for cameras and guests who only saw what they were allowed to see. Honestly, that ring. A voice cut through the music, sharp and careless, drawing attention as a woman with champagne in hand tilted her head toward Amara's fingers. It looks like something from a vending machine. Soft laughter followed, subtle but deliberate, the kind that never needed to be loud to wound. And Amara's hand tightened just slightly around the tray, her eyes lowering, not in shame but in practiced restraint, because survival had taught her that silence was safer than pride. The ring in question was simple, silver worn thin with time, resting against her skin like a secret she never explained, a thing she never removed, not even when others told her it looked out of place, because to her it wasn't decoration, it was memory, it was promise, even if she no longer remembered who made it. Across the room, Ethan reached for his glass, but the moment his eyes landed on that ring, something inside him fractured without warning, his fingers loosening, the glass slipping just enough to catch before it shattered. But the sound it made, a faint, sharp clink, cut through his chest louder than any gunshot ever could, his breath halting mid-motion as the world around him blurred into nothing but that small, worn circle of silver. He froze, completely, the kind of stillness that didn't belong in a room filled with music and laughter, his mind dragging him backward without permission, past the suits, past the power, into a memory buried so deep he had convinced himself it no longer existed, a narrow alley, cold, concrete beneath bare feet, the smell of rain and hunger, a girl with eyes too kind for a world that gave her nothing, and his own voice, younger, desperate, holding out a cheap ring bought with everything he had. I'll find you again. I'll marry you, I promise. The words echoed now like a ghost he couldn't silence. Ethan? His fiancée's voice pulled at him, but he didn't respond, couldn't respond, because across the room, the girl from that memory stood alive in front of him, not in the way he remembered, not in rags and fear, but still carrying that same quiet strength, hidden beneath years of being overlooked, and the ring, his ring, rested on her finger as if time had never moved at all, as if she had been waiting in a world that forgot her while he became the man who forgot everything. The room kept moving, laughter rising, glasses clinking, but Ethan Cole stood completely still, his eyes locked on something no one else understood, and for the first time in years, power meant nothing, because a promise he had buried was standing 10 feet away, wearing a maid's uniform, holding a tray, and reminding him of the boy he used to be. The music continued as if nothing had changed, but something had shifted in the air, subtle yet undeniable, like the moment before a storm that only one person could feel, and Ethan Cole was no longer listening to the laughter or the clinking glasses or the polished conversations drifting around him, because his entire world had narrowed to a single point, that ring, that impossible ring resting on the hand of a woman who was supposed to be invisible. Ethan, you are staring, his fiancée said. Softly, her voice controlled, her smile still, perfectly in place for the guests watching. But there was an edge beneath it now, something sharp and questioning, and still he did not answer, because he could not pull his eyes away, not yet, not when every second felt like it was peeling back years he had buried under ambition and survival. Across the room, Amara shifted her weight slightly, sensing the attention without fully understanding it, her fingers tightening around the tray again as another guest waved her over without looking at Her face, just a gesture, just a command, and she moved because that was her role here. To serve, to pass unnoticed, to exist in the background of other people's lives. Careful. The same woman who had mocked her earlier said as Amara approached, her tone light but cutting. You do not want to drop anything, especially wearing jewelry like that. A few guests chuckled again, quieter this time, but enough, always enough. And Amara lowered her gaze, not responding, not reacting, because she had learned that dignity did not always speak out loud. Sometimes it simply endured. Ethan's jaw tightened as he watched it unfold, something unfamiliar rising in his chest. Not anger the way he knew it, not the controlled, calculated kind he used in business, but something deeper, something older, something that did not belong to the man he had become, but to the boy he once was. The boy who had nothing except a promise he made with shaking hands and a heart that still believed in keeping it. Who is she? He asked suddenly, his voice low, not loud enough to draw attention, but enough to stop the man standing beside him mid-sentence. The conversation around them faltering for just a second as those closest turned slightly, sensing the shift in tone. A maid. Someone replied quickly, dismissively, as if that explained everything, as if that was all she could ever be, and Ethan's eyes did not leave her as he repeated quietly, almost to himself. No, not just a maid. The words barely audible, but heavy with something no one else understood. His fiancée followed his gaze now, really looking for the first time, her eyes narrowing slightly as she took in Amara, the uniform, the posture, the ring, and something flickered across her expression, not recognition, but irritation, the kind that came when something did not fit into the image she had carefully constructed. Excuse me, she said, stepping forward with effortless grace, her heels clicking softly against the marble as she approached Amara directly, the room parting just enough to make space, attention shifting again, curiosity rising like a quiet tide. Amara stopped as the woman approached, lifting her eyes just enough to meet hers, respectful but steady, and for a moment, neither spoke, the silence stretching thin. Then the fiancé smiled, the kind of smile that never reached her eyes, and reached out gently, almost delicately, toward Amara's hand, her fingers hovering just above the ring. That is quite an interesting piece for someone in your position, she said, her voice smooth, measured, every word chosen. Where did you get it? Amara hesitated for the briefest second, her breath catching not from fear but from the weight of something she could not fully explain, and then she answered simply, quietly. I have had it for a long time. And across the room, Ethan Cole felt those words land like truth he had been running from, his heartbeat slowing and deepening at the same time, because somewhere beneath the noise, beneath the power, beneath the years, a promise was waking up, and it was no longer willing to stay buried. The air seemed to tighten around them as Amara's quiet answer settled into the space between polished marble and whispered judgment. And for a brief moment, no one spoke, not because they understood the weight of her words, but because they sensed something shifting that did not belong to their world of rehearsed smiles and effortless privilege. Ethan Cole took a slow step forward, almost without realizing it, his gaze fixed, unwavering, as if every movement he made now was being pulled by something far older than the life he had built, and across from him, his fiancée's fingers finally closed around Amara's wrist, not harsh, not forceful, but deliberate enough to draw attention, to claim control over the moment. A long time, she repeated softly, tilting her head with polite curiosity that barely concealed her skepticism, her thumb brushing lightly against the ring as if testing its worth. It does not look like it came from anywhere meaningful. A few guests leaned in just slightly, drawn by the subtle tension, by the promise of quiet entertainment dressed as conversation. Amara did not pull her hand away, but her shoulders straightened just enough to reveal something deeper than compliance, something rooted, something unshaken, and when she spoke again, her voice remained calm, steady, almost gentle. It means something to me. And that was all. No explanation, no apology, just truth offered without decoration. Ethan stopped walking, the distance between them now small enough that he could see the faint wear along the edge of the ring, the tiny imperfection near the band that his mind recognized before logic could catch up, and suddenly the past was not distant anymore. It was sharp, immediate, alive, the memory of cold nights and empty stomachs, of holding on to hope with nothing but stubborn belief, of placing that exact flaw into the metal with hands that did not know how to make anything perfect, only real. You should not be wearing something like that here, his fiancée continued, her tone still composed but firmer now, the subtle authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. It does not match the environment. And with that, she gently lifted Amara's hand just slightly higher, enough for others to see, enough to make the moment public without ever raising her voice. Take it off. The words were soft, but they carried expectation, the kind that rarely needed to be repeated. The room quieted again, not completely, but enough that nearby conversations faltered, enough that attention drifted toward the small scene unfolding in the center of elegance and control. Amara hesitated, not out of fear, but out of something more complicated, something that lived between memory and instinct, her fingers tightening just slightly as if the ring itself anchored her to something she could not name, and for the first time, her eyes lifted fully, meeting the woman's gaze with a quiet strength that did not challenge, but did not yield either. I would rather keep it on, she said, and the simplicity of it landed heavier than any argument could have, because it was not defiance for the sake of pride. It was protection for something sacred. Ethan's breath slowed, deeper now, his pulse steadying in a way that felt unfamiliar, as if the chaos inside him had found direction, and before his fiancée could respond, before the moment could tilt further into something irreversible, his voice entered the space, low, controlled, but impossible to ignore. Let her hand go, he said, not loudly, not sharply, but with a quiet authority that carried further than any raised tone ever could, and the effect was immediate. His fiancée's fingers pausing, the room holding its breath, and for the first time that evening, Ethan Cole was no longer watching from a distance. He was stepping into something he could not walk away from, because the promise he had buried was no longer just a memory. It was standing in front of him, asking to be remembered. For a fraction of a second, nothing moved, not the guests, not the music, not even the air that seemed to hang heavier between them. And then, slowly, his fiancée released Amara's wrist, her fingers retreating with controlled grace as if she had chosen to let go rather than being told. But the shift in her expression betrayed something else, something colder, sharper, something that had not been there before. I did not realize this was important to you, she said, turning her gaze toward Ethan. Now, her voice still calm but laced with quiet challenge. It is just a ring. The words lingered, light on the surface, heavy underneath, and Ethan's eyes remained on Amara for one heartbeat longer before he finally looked at the woman beside him. Really looked at her, not as a partner in power, not as part of an arrangement, but as someone standing between him and something he could no longer ignore. It is not just a ring, he replied, his voice steady, each word measured, and though he did not raise it, the room seemed to lean closer, drawn by something deeper than curiosity, something that felt like truth pushing its way to the surface. Amara stood still, her hand lowering slowly back to her side, her fingers instinctively brushing against the ring as if grounding herself, her mind trying to follow the sudden shift in tone, the attention, the weight of being seen in a room that had been designed to overlook her. And yet she said nothing, because this was not her world, and whatever was happening did not belong to her understanding, not yet. Ethan, his fiancée continued, softer now, but more deliberate, stepping closer to him as if to reclaim the space. Between them, we have guests. The reminder carried expectation, a return to order, to the script that had been written long before this moment. But Ethan did not move back into place, did not step into the role waiting for him. Instead, his gaze drifted once more to Amara, and something in his expression changed, not dramatically, not enough for everyone to see, but enough that those closest felt it, a quiet unraveling of certainty. "What is your name?" he asked, not looking at his fiancée now, not looking at anyone else, only at the woman who had been invisible minutes ago, and the question itself shifted the room again, because it was not something he needed to ask, not something he would normally ask, not something that fit into the distance he maintained from those who worked under his roof. Amara hesitated, just briefly, her breath catching at the unfamiliar attention, before answering. Amara, her voice soft but clear, and when he repeated it, Amara, it sounded different in his mouth, slower, as if he were testing something, confirming something, holding on to something fragile that could disappear if spoken too quickly. The name settled into him, not as new information, but as recognition delayed by years and circumstance, and behind his eyes, the past shifted again, clearer now, sharper, the image of a girl sitting beside him on cracked pavement, sharing the last piece of bread between them, laughing quietly despite everything they did not have, and though her name had been spoken 1,000 times in those days, it had faded, buried under survival and ambition, until now. I need you to come with me, he said finally, the words directed at Amara but carrying a weight that made others straighten, that made the staff nearby pause, unsure, that made his fiancée's expression tighten ever so slightly as she stepped back, just enough to observe instead of intervene, because whatever was happening had moved beyond something she could control with a simple gesture. Amara blinked, uncertain, her eyes flicking briefly around the room as if searching for permission she did not need but had always been required to seek, and when she nodded, it was small, cautious, but firm, and as Ethan turned, leading her away from the center of the room, the music seemed distant again, the conversations resuming slowly, but not quite the same, because something had been disturbed, something had shifted, and though no one could name it, they all felt it, the quiet beginning of a moment that would not be forgotten. The hallway beyond the main room felt different, quieter, the polished marble stretching beneath their steps as the sound of laughter and music faded into a distant echo. And for the first time that night, there was space, not just physical space, but something else, something heavier, something that pressed against Ethan Cole's chest with every step he took ahead of her. Amara followed a few feet behind, her movements careful, measured, her mind trying to make sense of what had just happened. The way the room had shifted, the way the most powerful man in that space had spoken to her, as if she were more than a shadow passing through it. And yet she said nothing, because silence had always been safer than asking questions that had no place in her world. Ethan stopped near a floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the city, the skyline glowing with thousands of lights that once meant everything to him, symbols of power, control, achievement. But now they blurred slightly as he stared past them, his reflection faint in the glass, layered over the memory that would not let him go. "Where did you get the ring?" he asked again, his voice lower now, not the voice he used in boardrooms or negotiations, but something quieter, something almost uncertain, and the question lingered between them as Amara stepped closer, just enough to be heard without raising her voice. "I have had it since I was a child," she answered, her fingers brushing lightly against the metal as if confirming it was still there, still real. "I do not remember much from before, but I remember this." Her words were simple, unembellished, but they carried a weight that settled deep into Ethan's chest, because they matched the fragments in his own memory too perfectly to ignore. He turned slowly then, facing her fully for the first time away from the crowd, studying her features with an intensity that would have unsettled anyone else. But Amara did not step back, did not look away completely, because there was something in his gaze that did not feel like judgment. It felt like searching. "Do you remember who gave it to you?" he asked, each word deliberate, as if he were building towards something he was not yet ready to say. And Amara hesitated, her brow tightening just slightly as she reached for something just out of reach in her mind, a memory that had never fully formed. "No," she admitted softly. "Only that he said I should keep it, that it mattered." She paused then, her voice lowering just a fraction. "He said he would come back one day." The words landed gently, without expectation, without demand, just a memory spoken aloud, and for Ethan, they struck with the force of something long buried breaking through the surface. He looked away briefly, his hand pressing lightly against the glass as if grounding himself in the present, because the past was no longer a distant shadow. It was standing in front of him, breathing, speaking, carrying a promise he had failed to remember until now. "And you believed him?" he asked, not turning back immediately, his tone unreadable, and Amara gave the smallest nod, her expression calm, almost peaceful in a way that did not match the hardship her life had clearly held. "I did," she said. "I do not know why." But I kept it because it felt like something I should not lose. Silence followed, deep and still, stretching between them as the city lights flickered beyond the glass. And in that silence, Ethan Cole felt something shift inside him. Not sudden, not explosive, but certain, the kind of certainty that does not need to be announced, only acknowledged. He turned back to her slowly, his eyes no longer searching, but knowing. And though he did not speak the truth yet, though he did not break the fragile balance of the moment, the weight of it filled the space between them, because the promise he had once made with nothing to offer had found its way back to him in a room where he had everything, and for the first time in years, none of it felt as important as the quiet woman standing in front of him, holding on to something he had forgotten, something he could no longer walk away from. The silence between them did not feel empty. It felt full, heavy with something neither of them had fully spoken yet. And for a long moment, Ethan Cole simply stood there, looking at her, as if he were trying to reconcile two different worlds that should never have met again. The one he had built with precision and control, and the one he had abandoned without ever looking back. Amara shifted slightly, the faint sound of fabric brushing against itself the only movement in the stillness. Her eyes lowering just a fraction, as if unsure how long she was meant to remain there, how long this moment was allowed to exist before reality returned and reminded her of her place. "You can go back if you need to," Ethan said finally, though his voice lacked the finality such words usually carried, as if even he did not want the moment to end. And Amara nodded gently, not questioning, not lingering, because she had learned that when someone like him gave you permission to leave, you left. And yet as she turned, her hand brushed lightly against the ring again, almost unconsciously, and that small gesture held his attention more than anything she could have said. She had taken only 2 steps when his voice came again, quieter this time, but more certain. "Wait." And she stopped, not immediately turning back, but pausing as if measuring whether she had truly heard him correctly, before slowly facing him again. Ethan took a breath, a controlled inhale that steadied something inside him. Because the truth was there now, clear, undeniable, but saying it would change everything, not just for her, but for him, for the life he had constructed so carefully, for the future already planned with someone else. "There is something else you remember," he said, not as a question, but as a quiet push, and Amara's brow furrowed slightly, her gaze drifting downward as she searched through fragments that never fully connected. "I remember a voice," she said slowly. "He said I should not be afraid, that things would be different one day." She hesitated, her expression tightening just slightly as if the effort of remembering pressed against something fragile, "and that he would come back for me." The words hung between them, soft but unbreakable, and Ethan closed his eyes for a brief second, not to escape, but to steady the wave of memory that followed, because he could hear his own voice in hers, younger, unguarded, filled with a certainty he had not felt in years. When he opened his eyes again, they were different, not softer exactly, but clearer, stripped of something distant that had always separated him from others. And when he spoke, it was slower, more deliberate. "Amara, do you remember where that place was?" The question seemed simple, but it carried weight, and she shook her head gently. "No, just that it was cold, and we were always outside." She paused, her fingers tightening slightly around the edge of her sleeve. "But I was not alone, and that was what stayed with her. Not the hunger, not the cold, but the presence of someone who had made it feel less unbearable." Ethan turned slightly, his gaze drifting back to the city beyond the glass. The lights no longer symbols of success, but markers of distance, of how far he had come and how much he had left behind. And for a moment, he said nothing, letting the silence stretch again, because once he crossed the line from knowing to saying, there would be no returning to the version of himself that had ignored this past. Behind them, faint echoes of the party continued, laughter rising and falling, unaware of the quiet shift happening just beyond the room, unaware that something far more significant than any business deal or social alliance was unfolding in the space between a man who had everything and a woman who had kept a promise without knowing if it would ever matter. Ethan finally turned back, his gaze steady, his posture unchanged, but something in his presence altered in a way that could not be reversed, because the distance between them was no longer defined by status or role, It was defined by time, by memory, by a promise that had survived years of silence. And though he still had not said the words, the truth was no longer hidden. It was waiting, just beneath the surface, ready to change. Everything the moment it was spoken. The distance between them no longer felt like space. It felt like time stretching thin, fragile, waiting to break. And Ethan Cole knew that if he allowed this moment to slip away again, it would not return, not in this lifetime, not in any version of the future he had planned. Amara stood quietly, her posture still respectful, still measured, but something in her eyes had shifted, not recognition, not yet, but awareness. The kind that comes when something unseen begins to take shape, when a moment refuses to pass like all the others. Amara, he said again, her name slower now, steadier, as if grounding himself in it. And when she looked at him fully this time, there was no avoidance, no lowering of her gaze, just a quiet readiness to listen. He took a step closer, not enough to invade her space, but enough that the distance between them no longer felt like separation, and for a second, he hesitated. Not because he doubted what he knew, but because saying it would force him to confront everything he had chosen to forget. There was a night, he began, his voice lower, softer than anyone in that building had ever heard it. It was cold, colder than anything you should have had to endure. The words came slowly, not rehearsed, not polished, but real, and as he spoke, Amara's expression changed, not dramatically, but enough that something flickered behind her eyes, something pulling at memory that had never fully formed. We had nothing, he continued, his gaze steady. On her, no food, no place to go, just a street corner, and whatever hope we could pretend to hold on to. Amara's breath shifted slightly. A small inhale, she did not seem to notice, and her fingers moved again, brushing the ring as if it were responding to something inside her. You were sitting beside me, Ethan said, and now his voice carried something heavier, something undeniable. And you were not afraid, not the way anyone else would have been. He paused then, watching her carefully, because this was the moment where memory either returned or stayed lost forever. Amara's brow furrowed, her gaze drifting past him for just a second, as if trying to see something beyond the present, something just out of reach. And then she spoke, almost without meaning to. There was a blanket. Her voice was quiet, uncertain, but it stopped him completely. It was too small, but we shared it. The words landed softly, but they carried weight, because they were not guesses. They were pieces, real pieces, and Ethan felt something inside him settle into place. Yes, he said, the single word steady, confirming what neither of them had fully understood until now. And I told you something, he added, his voice dropping even lower, not for secrecy, but for significance. And Amara looked at him again, her eyes searching now, not passively, but actively, as if she could feel the shape of the truth forming between them. You said, she hesitated, her lips parting slightly as if the words were there but fragile. You said things would be different one day. Her voice trembled just slightly, not with fear, but with the weight of remembering something she had never expected to matter again. And Ethan nodded once, slow, deliberate, his gaze never leaving hers. And I gave you that ring, he said finally, not loud, not dramatic, just truth spoken in its simplest form. And the moment the words left him, the world around them seemed to fall completely silent, as if even the distant music had faded, leaving only the space between them and the past that had finally found its way back. Amara did not move immediately, her expression still, her mind catching up to something her heart had already begun to recognize. And for the first time since this night began, she looked at him not as the man everyone else saw, but as someone familiar, someone she had known long before titles and power existed. And though she had not spoken the recognition yet, it was there, in the way her eyes held his, in the way her hand tightened slightly around the ring, in the way the silence between them no longer felt uncertain, but inevitable. The silence did not break all at once. It shifted, slowly, like something fragile settling into place after years of being forgotten. And Amara stood there with her breath caught somewhere between disbelief and recognition. Her eyes locked onto Ethan's, as if searching for the boy behind the man, the voice behind the memory. And for the first time, she did not look small. She did not look invisible. She looked like someone standing at the edge of a truth that could change everything she thought. She knew about her own past. "You," she began, but the word did not fully form, her voice faltering as the pieces rearranged themselves in her mind, not neatly, not perfectly, but enough that the shape of it became undeniable, and her hand lifted slightly, fingers trembling just enough to betray the weight of the moment as they touched the ring again, not as habit this time, but as confirmation. Ethan did not rush her, did not fill the silence, because he understood that recognition was not something you forced, it was something that arrived on its own terms. And so he stood there, steady, patient, his gaze unwavering, giving her the space to remember what he had already accepted. "You said you would come back," she finally whispered, the words barely audible, but they carried more certainty now, more than before, and when her eyes lifted fully to meet his again, there was something new in them, something that had not been there earlier that night, not just awareness, but connection. Ethan nodded once, slow, deliberate, his voice quiet but firm when he answered, "I said I would find you." And the truth of it settled between them, not as a dramatic revelation, but as something simple and undeniable, something that had existed long before the world they now stood in. For a moment, neither of them spoke, because there were no words that could fully bridge the years between who they had been and who they had become. And yet the distance did not feel impossible anymore. It felt real, something that could be acknowledged, maybe even crossed. Behind them, the faint sound of footsteps approached, measured, composed, and Ethan's fiancée appeared at the edge of the space, her presence cutting into the moment with quiet precision, her eyes moving between them, reading the silence, the shift, the connection she could not fully understand but clearly did not like. "Ethan," she said, her tone controlled, but there was tension beneath it now, something sharper than before. "Everyone is waiting." The reminder was gentle on the surface, but it carried expectation, a return to order, to the life that had already been decided. Ethan did not turn immediately, his focus still on Amara, on the truth that had just been spoken into existence. And when he finally looked away, it was not with the same detachment he had carried earlier. It was with decision forming, quiet but solid. Amara lowered her hand slowly, the ring catching the light for a brief second, and though her expression remained calm, there was something different in the way she stood now, not defiant, not bold, but grounded in a way that came from knowing she was no longer just a background figure in someone else's world. She was part of a story that had not ended. "You should go back," she said softly, her voice steady, not dismissing the moment, but acknowledging the reality around them, the guests, the expectations, the life he belonged to. And Ethan studied her for a second longer, as if weighing something only he could see, before giving the smallest nod, not agreement, but recognition. He turned then, stepping away, but not fully leaving, not the way he would have before, because something had changed, something irreversible. And as he walked back toward the room filled with light and noise, the distance between who he had been and who he was becoming felt smaller than it ever had before, and behind him, Amara remained by the window, her hand resting lightly over the ring, her eyes no longer searching the past, but quietly holding on to a promise that had finally found its way back to her. When Ethan Cole stepped back into the room, the noise returned, but it did not feel the same, not to him, and not to those who had been watching closely enough to notice the shift in his presence, because something had changed in the way he carried himself, not louder, not more forceful, but more certain, like a decision had already been made long before anyone else realized there was one to make. The guests turned subtly as he moved, conversations lowering just enough to follow him with quiet curiosity, and at the center of it all stood the woman who was supposed to become part of his future, her posture perfect, her expression composed, but her eyes searching him now, measuring something she could not quite name. "Ethan," she said again as he approached, her voice smooth, controlled, but no longer entirely steady beneath the surface. "Is everything all right?" The question was simple, expected, but it carried weight, because it was not really about the moment. It was about everything that had just happened beyond her reach. Ethan stopped in front of her, his gaze meeting hers fully, and for a brief second, the room seemed to hold its breath. waiting for him to step back into the role everyone understood, the man who followed through, who maintained order, who did not allow emotion to disrupt carefully built plans. But instead of returning to that version of himself, he spoke with the same quiet certainty that had begun in the hallway. No. The single word landed softly, but it carried further than anything louder could have, and the silence that followed was immediate, complete, because people like Ethan Cole did not say no without meaning it. His fiancée's expression shifted just slightly, not breaking, but tightening, her smile fading into something more controlled, more guarded. "I think we should not do this here," she replied, her voice lowering, trying to contain the moment, to bring it back into something manageable, something private. But Ethan did not move, did not lower his voice, because this was not something he intended to hide. "It should be said here," he answered, calm, steady, and now the entire room was listening, not openly, not obviously, but enough that every word mattered. He turned slightly then, his gaze moving past her, past the guests, to where Amara stood near the edge of the room once more, her posture quiet, her presence still understated, but no longer invisible, not to him, not to anyone paying attention. "There is something I should have remembered a long time ago," he said, not loudly, but with clarity, each word deliberate, and the room seemed to still around him. Because this was not business, not strategy, not performance. This was something else entirely. His fiancée followed his gaze now, her eyes landing on Amara again. An understanding began to form, not complete, but enough to unsettle the certainty she had held all evening. Ethan took a slow step forward, not toward power, not toward expectation, but toward something far simpler, far more difficult to ignore, and when he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of years he could not take back. "Some promises are made when you have nothing," he said, his eyes never leaving Amara's, "and they are the only things that are real." The words settled into the room, quiet but undeniable, and though no one spoke, the shift was complete, because the story they thought they were watching had changed into something they did not expect. Amara did not move, did not step forward, but her hand rested lightly over the ring, her expression calm, steady, and in her silence there was no demand, no expectation, only presence, and that made the moment stronger than anything else. Ethan stopped a few steps away from her, not closing the distance completely, not rushing what had taken years to return, and though he did not speak the future aloud, though he did not make declarations meant for spectacle, the truth was already there, in the way he stood, in the way he looked at her, in the way the room had fallen into stillness around them, because for the first time in a long time, Ethan Cole was not choosing power, he was choosing something he had once promised when he had nothing at all, and in that quiet decision, everything else in the room lost its importance, and no one dared interrupt the moment where a forgotten promise became something real again.